The wind sweeping down from the jagged peaks of the territory carried the distinct biting promise of early frost. It rattled the thin glass of the bakery windows and sent fine dust swirling across the worn wooden floorboards. Ruby Calder stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her hands coated in a dusting of white flour, staring at the heavy parchment resting on her cutting block. The official seal of the Territorial Land Office gleamed in the dim grey light of the afternoon, mocking her. Her breath plumed in the chilly air. She read the inked words until they blurred into a senseless string of jagged lines. Pursuant to Territorial Property Act, unmarried women lack the legal standing to hold commercial property titles. Comply by securing a lawful husband within 60 days, or forfeit the premises. 60 days. The parchment crinkled as her flour-stained fingers closed into fists. This bakery was her entire life. She had built the stone oven with her own hands after her father passed, her skin bearing the silver scars of burns and blisters to prove it. She knew the exact temper of the yeast, the way the dough yielded beneath her palms, the scent of rising bread that served as her only comfort in this brutal, unforgiving settlement. Now, the law written by men who had never built a fire from scratch or survived a winter on their own demanded she surrender it simply because she walked the earth without a man's name attached to hers. The brass bell above the door chimed a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the heavy silence. A gust of bitter wind swept into the shop, carrying Margot inside. The boarding house owner quickly pushed the heavy oak door shut against the howling draft, her thick woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "I received one too," Margot said, her voice stripped of its usual sharp humor. She walked closer, her boots thudding softly against the floorboards, and glanced at the crumpled letter under Ruby's hands. 60 days. They mean to starve us out, or force us into the arms of any brute willing to sign a ledger. "I won't do it." Ruby's voice was a low, fractured whisper. She turned away, pacing toward the massive stone hearth where the embers were dying, offering little warmth to her trembling frame. "I won't let some drunken fool from the saloon lay claim to my father's recipes. I won't be treated like a piece of livestock traded for a plot of land." "Then what will you do, Ruby Freeze in the mountains?" Margot's tone was harsh, but her eyes held a profound shared grief. "Look out that window. The snows are coming early this year. A woman alone out here without a roof doesn't survive until spring. And the men in this town, they know our time is running out. Miller is already boasting at the tavern that he'll have you baking his bread and warming his bed by month's end." A shudder ran down Ruby's spine, a revulsion so deep it made her stomach turn. She looked out the frost-edged window. The settlement of Coldwater was a grim collection of timber structures, huddled against the imposing forested mountains. Men drifted through the muddy streets, collars turned up against the wind. It was a harsh land that bred harsh people. "There has to be another way," Ruby murmured, pressing her forehead against the icy glass. Her eyes drifted down the street, past the saloon, past the general store, until they settled on a structure that stood slightly apart from the rest, the blacksmith's forge. Even in the fading gloomy light, the massive stone chimney belched thick, dark smoke into the grey sky. Through the open archway, the rhythmic thunderous strike of a heavy hammer against glowing iron echoed across the frozen mud. Every strike was precise, unyielding, a testament to raw strength and steady discipline. It was Kyle, the Apache blacksmith. He had arrived in Coldwater 3 years ago, a silent, imposing shadow of a man who worked harder than 3 men combined. He spoke little, keeping his gaze focused on the fire and the anvil. The townsfolk relied on his unmatched skill to fix their wagons and forge their plows, yet they treated him with a cold, suspicious distance. He was an outsider, a warrior displaced by a changing, violent world, surviving on the sheer strength of his calloused hands. "O'Connor is drinking himself to an early grave," Margot said, following Ruby's gaze toward the forge. "Word is the old man's liver is failing. When he dies, that forge goes to his nephew in the east. Kyle will be cast out. He cannot legally own the shop either." A desperate, fragile thought took root in Ruby's mind. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But in a frontier town that offered no mercy, it was the only path forward. "He needs the forge," Ruby whispered the words, forming a frantic rhythm in her chest. "I need the bakery." Margot stared at her, her eyes widening as the realization set in. Ruby, no, you cannot be serious. You do not know him. He is sober, Ruby interrupted, stepping away from the window, a sudden fierce heat replacing the chill in her blood. He is hard-working, and he is desperate just like me. A contract Margot, a marriage of survival on paper, nothing more. Before Margot could utter another warning, Ruby grabbed her heavy woolen cloak, throwing it over her shoulders. She stepped out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth of the bakery behind. The freezing air stung her cheeks like invisible needles, but she kept her gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the forge. The heat hit her the moment she stepped under the wooden overhang of the blacksmith's shop. The air smelled fiercely of hot iron-burning coal and the earthy tang of sweat. Kyle stood over the anvil, illuminated by the fiery orange glow of the forge. He was stripped down to a simple ash-stained linen shirt, the fabric clinging to the thick corded muscles of his broad back and shoulders. A jagged faded scar ran down the side of his strong jaw, a remnant of a past he never spoke of. He brought the heavy hammer down. Sparks showered the dirt floor like a storm of falling stars. Ruby stood in the shadows, shivering despite the heat of the fire, waiting for him to notice her. When he finally stopped lowering the hammer, he turned, his eyes dark and unfathomable as the midnight sky over the desert locked onto hers. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a towering wall of quiet strength waiting. "They are going to take my bakery," Ruby said, her voice trembling, though whether from the cold or her own sheer terror, she could not tell. She stepped into the light, pulling her cloak tighter. "The property law. Unmarried women have 60 days. Kyle remained perfectly still. The firelight flickered across his stoic features. He reached for a heavy cloth, slowly wiping the soot and sweat from his massive rough hands. "I have heard," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, like the shifting of tectonic plates deep beneath the earth. It was a voice that commanded immediate attention without ever raising its volume. "I know O'Connor is dying," Ruby continued, forcing herself to hold his intense gaze. "I know, when he goes, his nephew will sell this forge. You have built this place, Kyle. You are the one who keeps this town moving. But because of who you are, the law will not let you own it." A muscle feathered along his scarred jawline. His dark eyes narrowed slightly, a silent warning, but he did not turn away. "Speak your piece." Ruby swallowed hard, stepping closer to the warmth of the anvil. "Marry me." The wind howled outside, a savage beast tearing at the wooden beams of the roof. Between them, the only sound was the crackle of the dying coal. Kyle stared at her, his expression entirely unreadable. He looked at her flour-dusted hair, her pale, shivering face, and the desperate fire burning in her eyes. "A contract," Ruby rushed on, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 6 months. We marry on paper. We live under the same roof to satisfy the territorial inspector. I keep my bakery. You claim the forge as my husband, transferring the deed before O'Connor passes. When the dust settles, we annul the union. We go our separate ways. No claims, no expectations. A partnership of survival." Silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Kyle looked past her, out toward the freezing muddy street of the settlement that despised them both. He looked at the anvil, the tools he had meticulously cared for, the life he had forged from nothing but iron and willpower. "The town will talk," he said, finally, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who knew the cruelty of the world intimately. "They will look for any crack in the story. They will try to tear it down." "Let them talk," Ruby said fiercely, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "I would rather face their whispers than freeze to death in the snow. I'm not asking for romance, Kyle. I'm asking for an alliance." He looked down at her, really looked at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding pride that kept her standing tall despite her shivering frame. Slowly he reached out. For a brief, startling moment, Ruby thought he was going to touch her. Instead, his large, calloused hand moved past her shoulder, pulling the heavy wooden door of the shop fully shut against the biting wind, sealing them inside the warm, fire-lit sanctuary of the forge. "Tomorrow," Kyle said, his dark eyes burning with a sudden quiet intensity. "We go to the clerk tomorrow. If we do this, there is no turning back, Baker." Ruby released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Tomorrow. The morning broke not with sunlight, but with a pale, bruised greyness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the bones. The temperature had plummeted overnight. Frost coated the windows of the bakery in thick crystalline ferns, obscuring the harsh frontier town outside. Ruby dressed in her only formal gown, a dark, heavy wool dress she had worn to her father's funeral. The fabric was stiff and smelled faintly of cedar and old sorrow. She wrapped her thickest shawl around her shoulders, her fingers numb and trembling as she fumbled with the wooden buttons. When she stepped out into the street, the frozen mud crunched sharply beneath her boots. The wind was a living, breathing entity, shrieking down from the canyons and biting at any exposed skin. Kyle was already waiting by the steps of the territorial clerk's office. He had scrubbed the soot from his skin, though the faint shadow of ash remained ingrained in the deep creases of his knuckles. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin, his dark hair pulled back and tied with a simple leather thong. He looked entirely out of place against the bureaucratic whitewashed walls of the government building. A wild, untamed force of the frontier, forced into the narrow confines of civilized man's laws. He did not smile when she approached. He simply gave a single tight nod, his dark eyes sweeping over her shivering frame before he reached out and opened the heavy oak door for her. The clerk's office smelled of stale tobacco damp wool, and the sour scent of unwashed bodies. A thin layer of ice had actually formed over the inkwell on the clerk's scarred wooden desk. The man behind the ledger, a gaunt, sharp-nosed bureaucrat named Harrison, peered over his wire-rimmed spectacles at them. His gaze lingered on Kyle with thinly veiled contempt, before shifting to Ruby with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "State your business," Harrison rasped, pulling a woolen blanket tighter around his frail shoulders. "We are here to register a marriage," Ruby said. Her voice sounded alarmingly fragile in the cavernous room, so she cleared her throat and lifted her chin, projecting the stubborn pride that had kept her alive this long. "Pursuant to the territorial requirements." Harrison's thin eyebrows rose. He looked from the pale, flour-dusted baker to the towering, stoic Apache blacksmith. "Is that so? A rather sudden union, Mrs. Calder, and an unconventional one for this settlement. The law dictates a timeline, not a convention." Kyle's voice cut through the damp air, deep and resonant, vibrating with a quiet authority that made Harrison physically flinch. "Produce the ledger." With a disapproving sniff, Harrison broke the ice in his inkwell with the tip of his quill. The ceremony, if it could even be called that, was a brutal, stripped-down affair. There were no flowers, no congregation, no promises of eternal devotion. There was only the scratching of a steel nib against coarse paper, and the recitation of legal bindings that reduced human lives to property and clauses. "Rings?" Harrison asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "No rings," Ruby answered flatly. "Sign here." Ruby took the cold pen. Her hand shook so violently that the ink splattered slightly on the parchment. She forced her fingers to steady, signing Ruby Ann Calder for the very last time. Kyle took the pen from her. His large, calloused hand dwarfed the delicate quill, but his signature was bold, stark, and uncompromising. "You are legally bound," Harrison said, slamming the heavy ledger shut. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. "May God have mercy on this arrangement." They walked out into the freezing street as husband and wife. There was no celebration, no lingering gaze. The wind hit them instantly colder than before, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow. "I will come for your things at sundown," Kyle said, his breath pluming in the air. He did not touch her, maintaining that careful, respectful distance. "Pack only what you need." Ruby spent the rest of the daylight hours dismantling her life. She fit everything she owned into 2 wooden crates: her mother's silver-backed ear hairbrush, a quilt her grandmother had sewn a few changes of clothes, and her father's leather-bound recipe book. The bakery felt entirely hollow once her personal belongings were stripped from the small back room. It was just a shell of brick and timber now. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not a gentle drift, but sharp, horizontal bites of ice driven by a howling gale. A blizzard was rolling in off the mountains. Ruby dragged the first heavy crate to the front door. her muscles aching, the cold seeping through the soles of her boots. Before she could reach for the second, the door opened. Kyle stepped inside, bringing a flurry of snow with him. His broad shoulders were already dusted with white. Without a word, he crossed the room, picked up the heaviest crate, as if it weighed no more than a bundle of kindling, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. With his free hand, he reached down and effortlessly lifted the second crate. "The storm is breaking," he said, nodding towards the door. "Walk behind me. Use my back to break the wind." It was a grueling trek across the settlement. The snow was already accumulating rapidly, burying the mud, and transforming cold water into a treacherous white wasteland. True to his word, Kyle walked a few paces ahead of her, his massive frame absorbing the brutal force of the gale. Ruby kept her head down, focusing entirely on the deep tracks his boots left in the snow, stepping exactly where he stepped. When they finally reached the wooden cabin, attached to the rear of the blacksmith's forge, Kyle kicked the door open and ushered her inside. Ruby stumbled over the threshold, her teeth chattering violently, her fingers completely numb. Kyle set the crates down with a heavy thud and immediately turned to the massive stone hearth taking up the far wall. He threw 2 massive logs onto the glowing embers and stoked them with an iron rod until a roaring golden fire erupted, banishing the shadows. The cabin was remarkably sparse but immaculately clean. The floorboards were swept bare. The scent of wood smoke, oiled leather, and dried sage hung in the warm air. There was a small, sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a single door leading to the bedroom. "Stand by the fire," Kyle ordered softly. Ruby obeyed, moving toward the hearth. The heat hit her shivering body like a physical blow, causing her skin to prickle painfully as the blood rushed back into her extremities. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching as Kyle secured the heavy iron latch on the thick oak door, sealing them off from the screaming blizzard outside. The wind battered against the log walls. A furious beast denied its prey, but the cabin held firm. It was a fortress. Kyle pointed a calloused finger towards the single inner door. "That is your room. I've cleared the dresser. The bed is yours." Ruby blinked the warmth, slowly thawing her frozen mind. "Where will you sleep?" He gestured to a thick, woven Navajo blanket, and a simple pallet rolled out in the corner of the main room near the hearth. "Here. I am used to the floor, and I wake before the sun to stoke the forge. It is better this way." "Kyle, no," Ruby protested weakly, her conscience flaring. "It is your house. You shouldn't be displaced." "You are my wife," he interrupted. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. It wasn't spoken with romance, but with a profound, unyielding sense of duty. "Under this roof you are protected. You take the bed." He left no room for argument. Ruby nodded, retreating into the small bedroom to change out of her damp, freezing clothes. When she emerged wearing a dry woolen skirt and a thick knitted sweater, she found Kyle at the stove heating a heavy cast-iron pot of stew. They ate at the small wooden table in silence. It wasn't a hostile silence, but a heavy, assessing one. 2 strangers thrust into the most intimate of living arrangements, navigating the invisible boundaries of their shared space. The storm outside raged with terrifying violence, rattling the heavy wooden shutters, but the fire in the hearth crackled merrily, casting warm, dancing shadows across Kyle's angular, scarred face. "We need rules," Ruby said, finally setting her tin spoon down. The metallic clink was loud in the quiet room. "If we are to survive 6 months in this cabin without killing each other, we need boundaries." Kyle met her gaze over the rim of his tin cup. "Name them." "Privacy," she said, wrapping her hands around her own warm cup to steady her nerves. "We do not ask questions about the past. We do not pry. I will handle the cooking and the mending, because I cannot sit idle, but I am not your servant, and you—" She swallowed hard. "You do not expect anything from me, as a husband." Kyle's expression did not shift, but his dark eyes softened imperceptibly. He set his cup down slowly. "You think I brought you here to force myself on you?" "I think men in this territory view marriage as ownership," Ruby replied, her voice tightening with defensive pride. "And I belong to no one." "I'm Apache," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble that easily competed with the howling storm. "My people do not take what is not freely given. You belong to yourself, Ruby Calder. In this house, you have nothing to fear from me. That is my vow. The raw, unfiltered honesty in his words struck her like a physical weight. The tension that had been coiling in her spine since she received the government letter finally slowly began to unravel. She looked at his massive scarred hands resting on the table hands, capable of bending steel and breaking bones, and realized with a sudden startling clarity that those hands would never be raised against her in anger. "Thank you." She whispered the words barely audible over the crackling logs. "We keep our story simple." Kyle continued shifting the conversation to the practicalities of their survival. "If anyone asks, we have been quietly courting since the summer. We married quickly before the winter set in, so you would not be alone in the bakery. That is a truth the town can digest." Ruby nodded. Simple. Believable. Later that night, long after the lamp had been extinguished, Ruby lay in the dark bedroom, buried beneath a mountain of heavy quilts. The wind outside was a continuous deafening roar, a blizzard that would surely bury the settlement in snow by morning. It was a night meant for freezing. Yet for the first time in weeks, Ruby was warm. Through the thin, wooden door separating the bedroom from the main hearth, she could hear the rhythmic, steady breathing of the man sleeping on the floor. At some point in the deep freezing hours of the night, she heard the floorboards creak beneath his heavy tread. She held her breath as the sounds moved closer, but the door never opened. Instead, she heard the scrape of iron against stone, followed by the sudden bright crackle of fresh wood catching flame. He was feeding the fire, making sure the brutal cold could not reach her. Ruby closed her eyes, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Outside, the harsh world raged and screamed, threatening to tear everything down. But inside these thick log walls, sheltered by the silent, scarred warrior, who slept by the hearth, she was safe. It was a fake marriage born of desperation. But the warmth radiating from the stones was entirely real. The blizzard raged for 2 days, burying cold water beneath 3 feet of unforgiving, blinding white snow. When the sky finally cleared on the third morning, the temperature was so low that the air itself felt brittle, ready to snap. Ruby woke to the smell of strong, bitter coffee and the comforting heat of the hearth. She dressed quickly in the biting chill of the bedroom, her fingers clumsy on her buttons, and stepped into the main cabin. Kyle was already fully dressed in his heavy canvas coat and leather gloves. He had not only kept the fire burning all night, but he had also shoveled a clear path from their heavy oak door all the way to the street, the snow piled high on either side like the walls of a canyon. "I cleared a path to the bakery," Kyle said, setting a tin cup of steaming black coffee on the wooden table. He did not look at her for praise or gratitude. It was simply a statement of fact. He protected what was his. "The snow is packed hard, but there is ice beneath it. Step carefully." "Thank you," Ruby murmured, wrapping her hands around the hot tin cup, letting the warmth bleed into her skin. "I will be at the forge," he said, turning towards the door. "If you need me, you know where I am." The bakery was freezing when she arrived, the stone oven having gone completely cold during the storm. It took her an hour of arduous labor, splitting kindling and coaxing embers before the familiar comforting scent of yeast and warm flour began to fill the small room. But the warmth of the oven could not stave off the chill that walked through her door precisely at noon. The bell chimed. It was not Mrs. Patterson seeking fresh bread nor Margot looking for conversation. It was James Fletcher. The territorial inspector was a thin, severe man, tightly buttoned into a pristine wool coat that looked entirely out of place in a frontier settlement. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, scanning the bakery with a sharp, calculating gleam. He carried a leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm, a physical manifestation of the law that had nearly destroyed her. "Mrs. Calder," Fletcher said smoothly, deliberately ignoring her new legal name. He stepped up to the counter, removing his leather gloves finger by finger. "Or is it Mrs. Kyle now? Forgive me. The suddenness of your union has left the territorial office scrambling to update our records." Ruby wiped her hands on her flour-stained apron, her heart giving a violent, terrifying lurch against her ribs. She forced her spine straight, projecting a calm she did not possess. "It is Mrs. Kyle, and we saw no need to delay. The winter is harsh, as you can see." "Indeed." Fletcher's gaze drifted to the back room, taking in the empty shelves where her personal belongings used to rest. "A very pragmatic decision. Almost suspiciously pragmatic given the deadline of the Property Act. "There is nothing suspicious about a woman choosing a husband," Ruby replied, her voice cooling to match the frost on the windows. Fletcher smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. He leaned slightly over the wooden counter. "The territorial office takes marriage fraud very seriously, madam. A union of convenience orchestrated solely to circumvent property laws is a federal offense. It results in immediate annulment and the forfeiture of all assets, both yours and the blacksmith's." The threat hung heavily in the air, smelling of polished leather and malice. "I will be conducting a formal inspection of your living quarters." Fletcher continued tapping his gloved hand against the ledger. "To ensure the marriage is genuine, and I suggest you make yourselves visible to the community. A true husband and wife do not hide in the shadows." He turned on his heel and walked out, the bell chiming a discordant note in his wake. Ruby stood frozen for a long moment, the heat of the oven suddenly feeling like the fires of hell closing in around her. She locked the bakery early, abandoning a half-kneaded batch of dough, and ran through the snow-drenched street towards the forge. Kyle was at the anvil, the heavy hammer striking glowing iron with a deafening clang. He saw her immediately. The hammer stopped mid-swing. He set it down, the muscles in his forearms bunching tight, and stepped away from the fire. "Fletcher was at the bakery!" Ruby gasped, her lungs burning from the cold air and panic. "He suspects! He threatened a formal inspection, Kyle. He said we are hiding. If he proves this is a fraud, they will take everything." Kyle's expression did not change, but a dangerous dark stillness settled over him. He reached for a rough cloth, wiping his hands slowly. "He is looking for a reason to break us. We will not give him one." "He said we need to be seen," Ruby insisted, her voice trembling. "If the town believes we are a real couple, Fletcher has no witnesses to build a case." Kyle tossed the cloth onto a workbench. He reached for his heavy sheepskin coat hanging on a nearby peg and pulled it on. "Then we give them a show. Today is the provision market in the square. We go together." The town square was a treacherous expanse of packed snow and freezing mud. Dozens of settlers were out wrapped in heavy furs and wool bartering for winter rations, salted meats, and root vegetables. The moment Ruby and Kyle stepped into the square, the atmospheric pressure seemed to shift. Conversations dropped to hushed whispers. Heads turned. Eyes tracked their every movement. The prejudice of the frontier was a tangible, heavy thing. To the settlers of Cold Water, Kyle was an outsider, a savage tolerated only for his skill with iron. And Ruby was a stubborn, sharp-tongued woman who had fiercely guarded her independence. Together they were an anomaly, a target. A brutal gust of wind swept across the square, carrying shards of ice that stung Ruby's cheeks. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter, her teeth beginning to chatter. Without a word, Kyle shifted his position. He moved to her windward side, placing his massive broad body between her and the howling gale. It was a subtle movement, but the effect was immediate. The biting wind vanished, blocked entirely by the wall of his chest and shoulders. Ruby looked up at him in surprise, but his eyes were scanning the crowd, vigilant and sharp. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice a low vibration she felt as much as heard. They walked towards the vegetable stalls. A group of men loitering near the hardware wagons stopped talking as they passed. One of them, a burly ranch hand with whiskey on his breath, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow near Kyle's boots. "Hell of a thing," the ranch hand sneered loudly to his companions. "A white woman lowering herself to an Apache. Guess the baker was desperate for any mutt that would have her." Ruby stopped dead, a hot blinding fury rising in her throat. She opened her mouth to tear the man down, to unleash the sharp temper she was famous for, but before she could speak a word, Kyle moved. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head and locked his dark, fathomless eyes on the ranch hand. The sheer predatory stillness of the blacksmith was terrifying. It was the look of a wolf evaluating a rabbit. The ranch hand's sneer faltered. He took a nervous step back suddenly, finding the toe of his boot very interesting. Kyle turned his attention back to Ruby. He lifted his large, leather-gloved hand and placed it firmly against the small of her back. The touch sent a sudden, startling jolt of heat straight through her heavy wool coat. It was a possessive, unmistakable gesture of protection. It told the entire square, without a single syllable spoken, that she was his. That she was claimed, guarded, and entirely off limits to their cruelty. Ignore them, Kyle said softly, guiding her forward with a gentle pressure against her spine. They are cowards who speak only when they outnumber their betters. Ruby swallowed the lump in her throat, her anger melting into something far more complicated. She allowed him to guide her through the market. Everywhere they went, the whispers followed, but they kept their distance. Kyle's hand never left her back. He anticipated every gust of wind, shifting his body to shield hers. When she stopped to inspect a sack of winter potatoes, he stood closely behind her, his sheer size creating a safe, impenetrable sanctuary in the middle of a hostile crowd. It was an act. It was a performance for the judging eyes of the settlement and the lurking shadow of James Fletcher. Ruby knew this. She repeated it in her mind like a mantra. Yet as they walked back to the cabin, the heavy sack of potatoes resting effortlessly on Kyle's wide shoulder, Ruby could not shake the feeling of absolute security that had settled deep in her bones. For her entire life, she had fought her battles alone. She had defended her bakery, defended her father's legacy, defended her own worth in a world run by men. But out there in the freezing square, she hadn't needed to fight. Kyle had become her shield, a silent, immovable barrier between her and the harshness of the frontier. When they finally returned to the cabin, the heavy door thudding shut behind them, Kyle set the provisions on the table. He pulled off his gloves, flexing his scarred hands near the warmth of the hearth. The performance was over. The physical contact was gone. They saw us, Kyle set his back to her as he stoked the fire. It will give them something to chew on. Fletcher will hear of it. Yes, Ruby said quietly, unwrapping her shawl. She looked at his broad back, remembering the solid grounding weight of his hand against her spine. The cabin felt suddenly very small, filled with an invisible tension that had not been there this morning. Kyle, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned the firelight, casting half his face in deep shadow. Yes? She wanted to thank him. She wanted to tell him how strange it felt to be protected. But the words tangled in her throat, trapped by the terrifying realization that she was beginning to rely on a man she had promised to leave in 6 months. I will start the stew, she said, instead looking away. Kyle watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes reading the things she could not say. He gave a single, slow nod. I will chop more wood. The storm is not entirely finished with us. As he stepped back out into the freezing dusk, Ruby stood in the quiet warmth of the cabin, pressing a hand to her chest. Her heart was beating entirely too fast. The lie was supposed to be the hardest part of this arrangement, but as she listened to the rhythmic, comforting swing of his axe outside, she realized the lie was easy. It was the truth that was beginning to terrify her. The frontier did not simply endure winter. It fought a brutal, agonizing war against it. The second wave of the blizzard arrived 3 days later, tearing through the canyon with a ferocity that made the first storm feel like a gentle prelude. The wind did not merely howl, it shrieked, sounding like a chorus of dying animals clawing at the thick log walls of the cabin. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the water in the wash basin froze solid within an hour. Inside the cabin was an isolated island of warmth held together entirely by the blazing fire Kyle maintained in the massive stone hearth. Ruby sat at the small wooden table mending a tear in one of Kyle's heavy canvas work shirts. Her needle moved rhythmically, a quiet domestic task that felt entirely surreal amidst the roaring chaos outside. Kyle was sitting on a low stool near the fire, meticulously oiling a pair of iron tongs. They did not speak. They rarely needed to. A profound, comfortable silence had settled between them over the past week, built on mutual respect and the shared rhythm of survival. Then the violent pounding on the door shattered the peace. It was a frantic, demanding rhythm, barely audible over the screaming wind. Kyle's head snapped up, his dark eyes, instantly vigilant. He set the tong down, moving toward the door, with the silent, fluid grace of a predator. He lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door inward. A monstrous gust of snow blasted into the cabin, bringing with it the half-frozen, staggering form of James Fletcher. The territorial inspector collapsed over the threshold, his pristine wool coat caked in thick, solid ice, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of blue. He was shivering violently, his teeth clicking together like castanets. Kyle immediately shoved the heavy door shut, throwing his entire weight against the timber to secure the latch against the gale. Ruby dropped her sewing, springing to her feet. Fletcher! My horse! Fletcher gasped, his breath wheezing as he scrambled away from the door, drawn desperately towards the hearth. Spooked by the wind, threw me a mile down the trail. I barely made it to the light. He huddled practically inside the fireplace, extending his trembling, frostbitten hands towards the flames. The sheer irony of it struck Ruby like a physical blow. The man who had threatened to cast her out into the cold, the man who held the power to destroy their entire existence, was now seeking sanctuary by the very fire her fraudulent husband had built. You are a fool to travel in a whiteout, Kyle said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. He stood behind Fletcher, towering over the shivering inspector. I was making my rounds. Fletcher sneered, though the effect was ruined by his violent shivering. He glared up at Kyle, his icy eyes filled with a toxic mixture of resentment and desperation. Conducting official territorial inspections, including yours. The storm caught me unawares. You will thaw here, Kyle said, coldly, crossing his massive arms over his chest. When the storm breaks, you leave. Fletcher's eyes darted around the cabin as the warmth began to return feeling to his limbs. Even half frozen, the bureaucrat in him never slept. His gaze swept over the kitchen area, the small table with Ruby sewing, and finally landed on the corner near the hearth. He stared at the thick Navajo blanket, and the simple pallet rolled tightly against the wall. A cruel, knowing smile cracked his blue lips. A pallet on the floor, Fletcher asked, his voice dripping with sudden venomous triumph. He looked from the floor to Ruby, then to Kyle. Separate sleeping arrangements, Mr. Kyle. How terribly unromantic for a pair of newlyweds. Or exactly what one would expect from a business transaction masquerading as a marriage. Ruby's blood ran cold. The warmth of the fire completely vanished, replaced by a deep, suffocating panic. She opened her mouth frantically, searching for a lie and excuse, anything to stop the inspector from closing the trap. Kyle did not even blink. The cabin is poorly insulated, the blacksmith said smoothly, his deep voice an immovable wall against Fletcher's accusations. The cold drafts come through the floorboards at night. I am Apache. I do not sleep in a warm bed while my wife shivers. I keep the fire burning through the deep hours so she does not freeze. It is a matter of survival, Inspector, not romance. Fletcher's smile faltered slightly. It was a brilliant, unassailable defense grounded entirely in the stoic, protective nature Kyle had already established. But the inspector was not a man who surrendered easily. He looked out the frosted window, where the blizzard was currently burying the settlement under a mountain of impassable white. A noble sentiment, Fletcher said, pulling his damp coat tighter around himself. However, the storm is worsening. I cannot leave this cabin until morning. I am commandeering this hearth for the night in the name of the territorial office. I trust you two will not mind retiring to your marital bed, but since I will be tending the fire, you have no further need of the floor, Mr. Kyle. It was an ultimatum, the test. If Kyle refused, if they fought to remain separated, Fletcher would have all the proof he needed to annul the union and seize their properties the moment the snow melted. Ruby felt the color drain entirely from her face. She looked at Kyle, her eyes wide with terror. Kyle held Fletcher's calculating gaze for a long, heavy moment. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, without a single word of protest, Kyle turned to Ruby. It is late, he said, his voice softer now, but carrying an unmistakable command. Come, wife, let the inspector have the ashes. He walked toward the single wooden door of the bedroom and opened it. Ruby followed him, her legs feeling like lead, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She stepped over the threshold, and Kyle followed, pulling the door firmly shut behind them. The click of the latch echoed with finality. They were trapped. The bedroom was pitch black and aggressively, brutally cold. Because the hearth was located in the main room, this small space relied entirely on the ambient heat bleeding through the walls. With the door shut to keep Fletcher out, that heat was entirely cut off. The air was frigid enough to see their breath, the frost creeping up the interior walls, like crystal ivy. Ruby stood awkwardly near the edge of the mattress, the darkness absolute. She was shivering, though, whether from the plunging temperature or the overwhelming reality of the situation she didn't know. I am sorry, she whispered into the freezing dark. He trapped us. If we do not stay in here, if he hears us arguing... Take off your boots, Kyle's voice came from the shadows, low and pragmatic. She heard the rustle of heavy canvas as he removed his coat. "Get under the quilts! Do not take off your clothes, you will freeze!" Ruby fumbled in the dark, her numb fingers struggling with the stiff leather laces of her boots. She kicked them off and crawled onto the narrow, creaking mattress, pulling the heavy mountain of woolen blankets and quilts up to her chin. The bed was terrifyingly small. A moment later, the mattress dipped significantly under Kyle's immense weight. He slid beneath the heavy quilts beside her. They lay stiffly on their respective edges of the mattress, a suffocating, unbearable tension radiating between them. The cold in the room was rapidly becoming dangerous. Without the fire, the temperature was dropping into the lethal single digits. Ruby's teeth began to chatter violently, a physical reaction she could not control no matter how hard she clenched her jaw. Her entire body shook, the freezing air biting through her thick woolen skirt and sweater. For 5 agonizing minutes they lay in the dark, the wind screaming outside Fletcher, lurking on the other side of the thin wooden door. "You are freezing," Kyle murmured. "I am fine," Ruby lied through chattering teeth, curling herself into a tight, miserable ball. "You are a terrible liar, Baker." Before she could protest, Kyle moved. He shifted across the narrow mattress entirely, closing the careful, respectful distance they had maintained since the day they met. He reached out in the pitch black, his large, heavy arms wrapping securely around her trembling frame, and pulled her flush against his broad chest. Ruby gasped, her hands flattening against the solid, unyielding muscle of his torso. The heat radiating from his body was absolute and overwhelming. He was a human furnace. "Kyle," she breathed, her voice fractured. "Be still," he commanded softly, his deep voice vibrating directly against her ear. He tucked her head beneath his chin, his massive body curling around hers, shielding her entirely from the freezing air of the room. He pulled the heavy quilts up over both of their heads, creating a small, dark cocoon of trapped heat. "I made a vow that you would be protected under my roof. I do not break my vows." She was rigid against him for a long moment, painfully aware of every point where their bodies connected. She could feel the steady, powerful thumping of his heart against her cheek. She could smell the wood smoke, the hot iron, and the clean, masculine scent of pine and raw earth that clung to his skin. Slowly, as his incredible body heat bled into her freezing limbs, the violent shivering stopped. The tension melting from her muscles left her utterly exhausted. She relaxed against him, her head resting heavily on his chest, her hands curling unconsciously into the fabric of his shirt. "Better?" he asked quietly into the darkness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice incredibly small. The lie of their marriage dissolved entirely in that freezing, pitch-black room. There were no judging townspeople here. There was no territorial inspector watching them beneath the quilts. There was only the brutal, howling storm outside and the fierce, quiet warrior holding her together in the dark. "Why did you really agree to this, Kyle?" Ruby asked, the question slipping into the intimate, heavy silence before she could stop it. "Not the forge, not the property. Why did you look at me that night and say yes?" For a long time, the only sound was the wind and the steady rhythm of his breathing. His arms tightened around her slightly, an involuntary protective reflex. "Because I've spent my entire life building things for other people," Kyle confessed, his voice a low, rough rumble against her hair. "I have forged iron for men who despise me. I have fought battles for a world that cast my people aside. I was tired of being a ghost in a town that only saw me when something was broken." He shifted his calloused hand, coming up to gently, almost reverently, brush a stray lock of hair away from her cheek in the dark. "When you walked into my forge, you did not look at me like a ghost. You looked at me like a man." Kyle whispered, the raw honesty in his voice breaking through his stoic armor. "You are the fiercest thing I have ever seen, Ruby Calder. I said yes because for the first time in my life, I wanted to build a shelter for someone who actually deserved it." Tears hot and sudden welled in Ruby's eyes, soaking into the fabric of his shirt. Her throat ached with a profound, terrifying swell of emotion. She had spent her life fighting to prove she did not need a man to survive, but as she lay trapped in the bitter cold held safely against the chest of a warrior who saw her worth when the rest of the world treated her as property, she realized she didn't just need him to survive the law. She needed him. She tilted her head up in the dark, her trembling lips finding the rough, scarred line of his jaw. She pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his skin. Kyle inhaled sharply, his entire massive frame going entirely still. Then, slowly, purposefully, his hand moved to the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her pulse. They did not speak again. They didn't have to. The blizzard raged violently against the frontier walls, and the inspector slept by the dying embers of the hearth, utterly unaware that the fraudulent marriage he was trying to break had just become the most real thing in the entire territory. The morning light bleeding through the frosted window pane was weak and grey, offering no warmth, but it brought the dawn they had desperately prayed for. In the main cabin, the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. James Fletcher was already awake, stiff and furious, his pristine coat hopelessly wrinkled and smelling of stale smoke. When Ruby and Kyle emerged from the bedroom, fully clothed, their expressions carefully guarded, Fletcher leveled a glare at them that could have frozen boiling water. He had spent the night on a hard wooden chair waiting for a slip, a fight, a confession of fraud. He had received nothing but the unbroken silence of a united front. "The storm is broken," Kyle stated, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He walked to the door, throwing the heavy iron latch open to reveal a world buried in blinding white snow. "Your horse is likely in the livery by now. The path is clear enough for walking." Fletcher pulled his collar up his face tight with thwarted malice. He paused at the threshold, his pale eyes cutting from Kyle's imposing frame to Ruby. "You have survived the winter, Mrs. Calder. But the thaw always reveals what is buried. The territorial office does not forget." With that final venomous promise, he stepped out into the freezing drifts. Ruby let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 12 hours. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she leaned against the thick timber of the doorframe. Kyle turned to her. The careful, measured distance they had maintained for weeks was gone, burned away in the freezing dark of the bedroom. He reached out his calloused thumb, gently brushing a smudge of ash from her cheek. The touch was achingly tender, a stark contrast to the brutal world outside. "He is gone," Kyle murmured. "You are safe." "For now," Ruby whispered, leaning into his palm. It was the first time she had openly sought his touch in the daylight. "But he will not stop, Kyle. He will look for another way to tear this down." "Then we will rebuild it," he answered simply. "Every time." 3 weeks passed. The bitter edge of the blizzard softened into the muddy, slush-filled reality of a frontier thaw. The tension of Fletcher's visit lingered like a shadow, but inside the cabin a profound shift had occurred. They were no longer strangers performing a play. They were partners. Ruby learned the exact moment Kyle needed his coffee in the morning. Kyle learned to fix the temperamental damper on her bakery oven. They shared meals, shared quiet conversations by the hearth, and though the pallet remained on the floor for appearances, Ruby found herself lying awake at night, missing the overwhelming protective heat of him beside her. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind was whipping fiercely through the canyon, the church bell began to ring. It was not the slow, measured toll of a Sunday service. It was a frantic, chaotic clanging, the universal frontier alarm. "Fire!" Ruby rushed out of the bakery, her apron flying in the wind. A thick, oily pillar of black smoke was billowing into the pale sky from the far end of the settlement. It was one of the old, dilapidated rental cabins near the tree line. Fire in a frontier town built of dry timber and pitch was a death sentence. By the time Ruby reached the site, a chaotic bucket line had already formed from the town well, but the flames were devouring the roof with terrifying speed. The heat was a physical wall pushing the townsfolk back. "There are people inside!" A woman screamed over the roar of the inferno. "The Martinez family! The children!" Before the words fully registered in Ruby's panicked mind, a massive figure tore through the crowd. It was Kyle. He had discarded his heavy coat, carrying a soaking wet horse blanket from the livery. "Kyle, no!" Ruby shrieked, dropping her bucket. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. With a powerful kick of his heavy boot, he shattered the burning timber of the front door and disappeared into the blinding, choking smoke. The minutes that followed were an agonizing eternity. The roof groaned, the timber snapping like gunfire. Ruby stood frozen in the slush, the heat blistering her face, her heart stopping entirely. "He is going to die," her mind screamed. "The man who saved me is going to burn." Suddenly, a massive shape emerged from the wall of fire. Kyle stumbled out into the freezing mud. He was carrying 2 small coughing children under his arms, shielding them entirely with the wet blanket and his own broad body. Close behind him, gasping for air, came James and Mariah Martinez, clutching their youngest infant. The moment they were clear, the roof of the rental cabin caved in, with a deafening roar sending a geyser of orange sparks into the sky. Kyle dropped to his knees in the mud, hacking violently, his shirt scorched and his arms blackened with soot. Ruby threw herself to the ground beside him, her hands frantically grasping his face, checking for life for breath. "I have them," Kyle rasped, his voice raw and destroyed by the smoke. He looked at Ruby, his eyes bloodshot but fiercely alive. "They are safe." Ruby sobbed, pulling his soot-stained head against her chest, not caring who in the settlement saw her weeping over the Apache blacksmith. "You reckless, beautiful fool," she wept into his hair. The fire was eventually contained, leaving nothing but a smoking, charred skeleton of a home. The Martinez family sat in the freezing slush, wrapped in borrowed shawls, staring at the ashes of everything they owned. The townsfolk muttered their sympathies, but as the adrenaline faded, the harsh reality of the frontier set in. No one had the space or the resources to take in a family of 5. The crowd began to nervously disperse. Ruby looked at Maria Martinez, who was shivering violently, clutching her soot-stained baby. Then Ruby looked at Kyle. His forearms were blistered, his breathing shallow, but he met her gaze with that same unwavering stillness. He already knew what she was going to ask. He gave a single slow nod. "We have room," Ruby said, her voice cutting clearly through the murmurs of the retreating crowd. She walked over to Maria and hauled the exhausted woman to her feet. "Come, you will stay with us." That night, the small cabin attached to the forge was packed. The 2 older Martinez children slept on Kyle's pallet near the hearth, while Maria, James, and the baby took the bedroom. Ruby and Kyle sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen area. Ruby had a bowl of cool water and a clean linen cloth. She was gently, meticulously cleaning the burns on Kyle's massive forearms. The skin was red and angry, but the blisters were contained. He sat perfectly still, letting her tend to him, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "The town will talk," Kyle murmured, wincing slightly as she applied a salve of beeswax and pine resin. "Let them," Ruby replied, fiercely, wrapping a clean bandage around his thick wrist. They stood by and watched the family freeze while offering empty prayers. "I do not care about the opinions of hypocrites. Fletcher will use it," Kyle warned, his voice low, so as not to wake the sleeping children. "He will say, we are using charity to distract from our own fraud, that we are drawing attention to ourselves to play the martyrs. And then we fight him," Ruby said, tying the bandage off and resting her small flower-softened hands over his large calloused ones. "I am done hiding Kyle. You ran into a burning building today. You built this shelter. If they want to tear it down, they will have to go through both of us." Kyle turned his hands over, intertwining his thick fingers with hers. The gesture was incredibly intimate, a silent vow sealed in the smoky, crowded cabin. "Together," he agreed. The backlash was swifter than either of them anticipated. 3 days later, Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women from the church committee marched into the bakery. Their faces were pinched with that specific venomous brand of frontier righteousness. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Patterson began, her smile thin and devoid of warmth. "We need to speak with you about your living situation. It has come to our attention that you are housing the Martinez family." Ruby set down her wooden rolling pin, wiping her hands on her apron. "They lost their home. We had a roof. There is nothing to discuss." "It raises questions," the second woman, a sharp-featured blonde, interjected. "A newly married couple taking in 5 strangers in such a cramped space, it is highly irregular. Some might say it looks as though you are attempting to build public favor to hide certain irregularities in your own marriage." Ruby felt a hot, blinding flash of anger ignite in her chest. She stepped out from behind the counter, her small frame radiating pure fury. "Let me understand you. Our family was left to freeze in the mud, and because we opened our door to them, you believe it makes us suspicious." "Charity must be done properly, Mrs. Calder." Mrs. Patterson sniffed, deliberately using her maiden name. "By the right people, not used as a shield by an Apache and a woman trying to dodge the law." "Get out." Ruby's voice was dangerously calm. "If your Christian charity involves judging those who actually practice it, you have no place in my bakery. Get out before I throw you into the street myself." The women left in a flurry of offended gasps and pulled shawls. but the damage was done. The whispers grew into a roar. The bakery saw fewer customers. People crossed the muddy streets to avoid Kyle. The town was punishing them for refusing to lower their heads. A week later, the final blow landed. Ruby was at the forge bringing Kyle a plate of hot food when a territorial courier arrived on horseback. He did not speak to them. He simply handed Kyle a heavy, wax-sealed envelope bearing the crest of the capital and rode away. Kyle broke the seal with a soot-stained thumb. He read the heavy parchment, his jaw clenching so tight the scarred muscle leaped beneath his skin. "What is it?" Ruby asked, her heart dropping into her stomach. Kyle handed her the letter. The legal jargon was dense, but the words that mattered leaped off the page like sparks from the anvil. "Doye, upon review of community reports and inspector testimonies regarding the union of Ruby Calder and Kyle, the territorial board, has found sufficient inconsistencies to warrant an official charge of marriage fraud. You are hereby summoned to a final hearing at the territorial courthouse in 14 days. Failure to prove the legitimacy of this union will result in immediate annulment seizure of the Calder bakery and forfeiture of the blacksmith forge." Ruby stared at the paper, the world tilting violently on its axis. Fletcher had done it. He had taken their act of mercy, twisted the town's prejudice, and built a guillotine over their heads. 14 days, Ruby whispered, the parchment trembling in her hands. They are going to take it all. The bakery, the forge, everything we fought for. Kyle stepped closer. He reached out his massive bandaged hands, gripping her shoulders, grounding her in the present. The stoic, quiet blacksmith was gone. In his place stood a warrior preparing for war. "They only take it if we surrender Baker," Kyle said, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "We go to the hearing. We stand before their judge." "And tell them what?" Ruby cried, tears of sheer frustration spilling over her lashes. "That we lied, that we signed a fake contract?" "No," Kyle said, softly pulling her against his chest right there in the open doorway of the forge for the entire town to see. "We tell them the truth, that it started as a lie to survive their cruel laws. But the law did not keep you warm in the blizzard. The law did not pull those children from the fire. We did." He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her trembling lips. "We tell them," Kyle vowed, "that what we built in the ashes is more real than any paper they possess. We fight." The territorial courthouse was a monument to cold stone and rigid law, an imposing structure of grey granite that looked entirely alien against the wild sweeping backdrop of the frontier mountains. Inside, the high vaulted ceilings echoed with the sharp clack of leather boots and the low judgmental murmurs of men who decided the fates of the desperate. Ruby sat on the hard wooden bench of the courtroom, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. She wore her dark blue dress, the hem slightly damp from the melting slush outside. Beside her sat Kyle. He looked like a captive wolf in this house of civilization, his broad shoulders stretching the seams of his clean canvas coat, his dark hair pulled back neatly, revealing the stark white scar along his jaw. He was perfectly still, an immovable anchor in the churning sea of Ruby's anxiety. Across the aisle, James Fletcher sat with a smug, anticipatory gleam in his icy eyes. He was holding his leather-bound ledger, already savouring the taste of their destruction. "All rise," a bailiff droned his voice echoing off the stone walls. Magistrate Thorne, an elderly man with a face carved from weathered oak and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, took the heavy oak bench. He adjusted his spectacles, shuffling the thick stack of parchment before him. "We are here to review the territorial charge of marriage fraud against Ruby Calder and the Apache blacksmith known as Kyle." Magistrate Thorne announced, his voice a dry, rasping echo. "Mr. Fletcher, you bring this charge on behalf of the Territorial Land Office. Present your findings." Fletcher stood buttoning his pristine coat. He walked to the center of the room, turning slightly so the gallery of onlookers, which included several curious whispering settlers from Cold Water, could hear his triumph. "Your Honor," Fletcher began, his voice dripping with venomous formality, "the Territorial Property Act was designed to ensure that commercial land is held by stable, legally sound households. What we have here is a mockery of that institution. 60 days after..." Receiving her notice of forfeiture, Mrs. Calder rushed into a sudden unheralded union with a man who was legally barred from holding property titles in his own name, a man who conveniently needed a legal proxy to claim his dying employer's forge. Fletcher paced in front of their bench, his eyes locking onto Ruby. During a blizzard, I took shelter in their cabin. I witnessed with my own eyes a pallet on the floor. Separate sleeping arrangements, no affection, no shared life. Merely two business partners waiting out a clock. Fletcher sneered, turning back to the magistrate. And when suspicions arose, they suddenly took in a family displaced by a fire, a blatant theatrical display of domesticity to sway public opinion. It is a calculated fraudulent transaction, Your Honor. I demand immediate annulment and the forfeiture of both properties to the territory. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs, loud and frantic. Fletcher had woven the truth into a rope designed to hang them. Mrs. Calder, Magistrate Thorne said, peering down over his spectacles. Mr. Kyle, you have heard the inspector's testimony. Do you possess any evidence to counter these severe claims? Any letters of long courtship? Any proof that this union was born of genuine matrimonial intent? Ruby looked at the judge. She looked at Fletcher's triumphant sneer. Then she looked at Kyle. His dark eyes were steady, offering no false promises. Only the quiet, fierce strength that had kept her warm in the darkest winter of her life. She stood up. Her legs trembled, but she locked her knees, lifting her chin with the stubborn, unyielding pride of a woman who had built ovens from stone and survived the freezing frontiers alone. No, Your Honor, Ruby said. Her voice rang out clear and bright in the cavernous room. Fletcher smirked. Whispers erupted from the gallery. Magistrate Thorne frowned, reaching for his gavel. You admit to the fraud, madam? I admit to surviving, Your Honor, Ruby countered. Her voice rising above the murmurs, silencing them entirely. Inspector Fletcher is absolutely right. I did not marry for love. I married because your lawyers told me that my calloused hands, the burns on my arms, and the years I spent building my father's bakery meant nothing. Your laws told me I was property incapable of owning property. So I found a man who was treated just as cruelly by this territory, and we made a pact to save our livelihoods. She stepped out from behind the heavy wooden table, moving to the center of the floor. We signed a contract. We slept in separate spaces. We performed for the town, Ruby confessed, stripping away the lies until nothing remained but the raw, bleeding truth. But the law, Your Honor, is blind to what happens after the ink dries. Kyle stood up slowly. He did not step forward, but his sheer presence commanded the room's absolute attention. The inspector speaks of a pallet on the floor. Kyle's deep, resonant voice vibrated through the stone chamber. He does not speak of the blizzard that brought the temperature to lethal numbers. He does not speak of how I held my wife in the dark so she would not freeze to death while he slept by the embers. Fletcher's face flushed a furious mottled red. Objections, sentimental fabrications. I pulled children from a burning roof. Kyle continued, his dark eyes locking onto the magistrate, ignoring Fletcher entirely. My wife took in a family with nothing but the clothes on their backs, risking her last rations to feed them. The town mocked us. The inspector hunted us. But we built a shelter. We stood together. Kyle stepped forward, closing the distance until he was standing directly beside Ruby. He reached out, his massive scarred hand gently engulfing her trembling fingers. The contrast of his dark, callous skin against hers was a physical testament to the unlikely alliance they had forged. We lied to your clerk, Kyle said, his voice dropping to a low, fiercely protective rumble. But we are not lying now. This woman is my wife. I have bled for her, and I will die for her. No piece of paper can undo what the frontier has forged. Ruby gripped his hand tightly, fighting the tears burning in her eyes. We did not marry for love, Your Honor, she whispered the echo, carrying through the breathless courtroom. But the harshness of this land could not break us. It only forced us to become each other's only safe harbor. I love him, and I will burn the bakery to the ground myself before I let this territory tell me my marriage is not real. The silence that followed was absolute. The stone courtroom felt suddenly fragile, as if the sheer weight of their honesty had cracked the foundation. Fletcher was sputtering, gripping his ledger. Your Honor, this is a mockery. They just admitted to the initial fraud. The law is clear. Magistrate Thorne stared at the two figures, standing hand in hand in the center of the room. He looked at the fierce, trembling baker and the scarred, immovable Apache warrior. He looked at their joined hands, noting the white knuckles, the calluses, the undeniable physical truth of their bond. Slowly the magistrate picked up his wooden gavel. The Territorial Property Act, Thorn began, his voice dry and measured, was written to establish stability in a wild land. It is a flawed, archaic law that often forces the desperate into dark corners. The court recognizes the initial deception perpetrated by the defendants. Fletcher smiled, stepping forward. Ruby felt her chest tighten painfully. Kyle's grip on her hand became ironclad. However, Thorn raised a hand, silencing the inspector. The purpose of a marriage under the eyes of the law and God is a union of mutual survival, protection, and genuine partnership. Inspector Fletcher's own testimony confirms that these two individuals have cohabited shared burdens and face the lethal realities of the frontier as a single unit. To annul this union now would not serve the law. It would destroy a demonstrably true household to punish a past desperation. The magistrate brought the gavel down with a resounding crack. The charges of fraud are dismissed, Thorn declared, his voice echoing with finality. The marriage of Ruby Ann and Kyle is recognized as lawful and binding. The titles to the Calder Bakery and the Blacksmith Forge remain secured in their names. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted. Fletcher stood frozen, his face pale with shock and outrage, his ledger slipping from his grasp to hit the stone floor. Ruby gasped, a sob breaking free from her throat. Her knees finally buckled, the adrenaline leaving her body in a sudden, overwhelming rush, but she didn't fall. Kyle caught her, his strong arms wrapping securely around her waist, hauling her against his solid chest right there in the center of the courtroom. He buried his face in her hair, his massive shoulders trembling with a profound, silent relief. We won. Ruby wept against his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine. Kyle, we won. You fought, he murmured into her hair. You did not back down, my fierce baker. They walked out of the courthouse an hour later. The grey clouds that had choked the sky all morning had finally broken. The first snow of the late season was falling. Not the violent biting shards of a blizzard, but large gentle flakes that drifted down like white feathers, settling softly on the muddy streets of the capital. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled of new beginnings. Kyle stopped on the wooden steps of the courthouse, pulling Ruby out of the flow of foot traffic. The snow gathered in his dark hair and dusted the shoulders of his canvas coat. He looked down at her, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them, carrying a light that had not been there when she first walked into his forge all those months ago. The contract is finished, Kyle said quietly, the snow falling around them in a silent curtain. The law is satisfied, the forge is secure, and the bakery is yours. If you wish to walk away now with your freedom, I will not stop you. Ruby looked at the man who had slept on a freezing floor to give her a bed, who had shielded her body from the howling wind, who had run into fire without hesitation. She reached up, her small hands framing his rough, scarred face, her thumbs brushing away the melting snowflakes from his cheekbones. I told the magistrate I would burn the bakery to the ground before I let them separate us, Ruby whispered, rising on her tiptoes. Did you think I was lying? A slow, breathtaking smile broke across Kyle's face, a rare, brilliant expression that completely transformed his stoic features. It was the smile of a man who had finally found a home. No more contracts, Kyle vowed, his voice a deep, resonant promise against the falling snow. No more lies, Ruby, just you and me, until the mountains crumble. Until the mountains crumble, she echoed. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, passionate kiss. It was not a performance for the town, nor a desperate bid for warmth in the dark. It was a true, unshakable vow forged in the fires of survival, and sealed in the quiet mercy of the winter snow. The harsh world would always be there, waiting at the edges of their cabin, but they would never have to face the storm alone again.